One of the big issues that is really perplexing Republicans is how to pay for all of this. Remember, the Senate plan builds in about $1.5 trillion in tax cut revenues that would be lost over the next decade. The idea being that economic growth, though, will address a lot of that. In fact, a lot of top economists and numbers crunchers, former top economic honchos in a variety of administrations, penned a letter to on this very issue, saying essentially just that we will see growth from these tax cuts, much more so than have been anticipated in the past. Among them was Glenn Hubbard, former Bush 43 economic advisor, economic council chair. Glenn, very good to have you.
It's a pleasure.
Now, let's talk a little bit about that. Many Republicans are concerned. I don't want to bust the deficit. I don't want to dramatically add to the debt. But you and a lot of, I'll call them geeky colleagues, but brilliant geeks all, came to the conclusion that they're worrying a bit much. Explain.
Well, they're worrying about the right thing, of course, except we also need the economy to grow. And the question is, if you do the right kind of tax reform, particularly corporate tax reform, which is what's being contemplated, you do get higher GDP because of higher investment. And so a lot of this will come back to the government. And I think the goal ought to be pro-growth policy, and that's why the corporate piece of this is actually pretty good.
Now, Douglas Holtz-Eakin signed on to this, George Shultz, Larry Lindsay, John Taylor, who's who have argued that this could boost GDP, and that alone could go a long way to providing additional revenues. But what I've noticed in the past with surges in GDP is getting them to last longer than a quarter or two or three at a time. Do you think that the average that you would see for the 10 years would consistently be at 3% or better versus 2% as has been the average over roughly the last decade?
Well, there's no question GDP will grow faster over the next decade if we have a fundamental tax reform. Getting all the way to steady state 3% growth, though, requires us to do a lot more than the tax code. It would require regulatory changes and other things that would help boost productivity.
But Glenn, this alone doesn't do that then, right?
I think it will raise growth. I don't think it's going to get you all the way to 3% forever. What we concluded in the letter is you'd raise the level of GDP by 3%.
To sustain that, and well, obviously there has to be a revisiting of all of this. The fear Republicans have is that even if they pass this and get it done, the impact and feeling the impact could be months, maybe years away. And by that time,
I don't agree.
Oh, good, because that was what I was going to ask. Because some of them fear that if that happens, they're going to lose the midterms. Go ahead.
Well, here's the way I think about it. I can't opine on the politics, but on the economics, if the corporate rate cut is delayed a bit, which is in the bills, and you have expensing of investment, you'll have a lot of investment in anticipation of a future rate cut. So if anything, activity is going to be front-loaded, not back-loaded. There will still be long-term very positive effects because over time, as the capital stock grows, that's higher output and higher wages for all Americans.
So even though we're better than what used to be called full employment right now, even though corporate balance sheets look pretty robust right now, even though the market's been on fire right now, that it could be even more so with these tax cuts in effect?
Well, the market, of course, has already been pricing some probability of tax cuts. Right. But in terms of the real variables you mentioned, output and wages and investment, absolutely yes.
Okay. Very good. Glenn, thank you very, very much. Glenn Hubbard, the former Bush 43 economic advisor, economic counsel.